If you had one wish, just one, and you knew it would come true, would you choose yourself? The question landed softly, almost lost beneath the quiet clinking of silverware and the low hum of late-night conversations, but it made Lily Carter freeze mid-step, her pen hovering over a half-written order as she looked up at the man sitting alone in booth 7. The diner was nearly empty now, just past 9:40 p.m., the neon open sign flickering faintly against the rain-streaked window, and outside the streets of Chicago blurred under a steady downpour, the kind that soaked through cheap sneakers in seconds and made everything feel heavier than it already was. Lily tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear, forcing a polite smile the way she always did, because tips mattered and rent didn't wait, but something about the way he asked, calm, steady, like he actually cared about the answer, made her hesitate longer than she should have. The one wish, she repeated lightly, trying to keep it casual. Though her fingers tightened around the order pad, the man nodded, dressed in nothing remarkable, dark jacket, worn jeans, the kind of look that blended into the background, but his eyes didn't. They were focused, observant, like he was studying more than just her words. Lily let out a small breath, glancing across the diner where a young family sat near the window, their voices low, their plates barely touched, a little boy coloring quietly on a napkin while his mother counted bills with a crease of worry between her brows. Lily looked back at the man and shrugged. Deflecting, "That's a pretty big question for a Tuesday night," she said with a faint laugh, but her voice carried a tired edge she couldn't quite hide. He didn't smile back, not fully, just leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Humor me," he said, and something about the simplicity of it made it harder to brush off. Lily's gaze dropped to her notepad where, tucked behind the current orders, a small folded slip of paper peeked out, creased, worn. Something she carried with her every shift, a quiet reminder she never talked about. She swallowed, her mind flickering through everything she could say. Everything she needed, past due rent, her mom's medical bill stacked on the kitchen counter, the eviction notice folded neatly like it might hurt less if it looked organized, but the words didn't come out. Instead, she found herself glancing back at that family again, at the boy now tugging gently on his mother's sleeve, whispering something that made her blink quickly and look away. Lily exhaled slowly, then looked back at the man. Her expression softer now, more honest than she usually allowed herself to be. "I think," she started, her voice quieter, "I think some people need miracles more than I do," she said, almost to herself, before catching it and offering a small, apologetic smile like she'd said too much. The man didn't interrupt, didn't react the way most customers would, with confusion or polite indifference. He just watched her, as if that answer mattered more than anything else she could have said. Lily shifted her weight, suddenly aware of the clock ticking behind the counter, of the long night still ahead, of the fact that she was standing here entertaining a question that wouldn't change anything about tomorrow. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, slipping back into routine, into safety, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. The man leaned back slightly, considering her, then nodded once, almost to himself. "Yeah," he said quietly, "you already did," and for a second, just a second, Lily felt like she'd missed something important, but before she could figure out what, the bell above the door chimed, the rain grew louder, and the night kept moving forward like it always did. By the time the rain finally slowed to a thin mist, the diner had emptied out, leaving behind the faint scent of coffee and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights that never quite turned off, and Lily Carter stood behind the counter counting tips with careful fingers, stacking crumpled bills into neat little piles as if order could somehow stretch them further than they were meant to go. $12.75 from the last hour, she noted quietly. Not great but not terrible, just enough to make tomorrow feel slightly less impossible. She slid the money into her apron pocket and reached for her bag, her shoulders aching in that dull, familiar way that came from too many double shifts and not enough rest, but her mind kept drifting back to the man in booth 7, to the way he had asked that question like it meant something, like her answer had actually mattered. She shook her head slightly, trying to push the thought away as she stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her face, damp but refreshing after the warmth of the diner, and pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself as she started the 3-block walk to the bus stop, her sneakers splashing lightly through shallow puddles along the cracked sidewalk. Chicago at night felt different when you were tired, quieter but heavier, like every streetlight carried its own weight, and Lily kept her gaze down, focused on each step, on getting home, on getting through one more day. When she reached the bus stop, she paused under the narrow shelter, checking her phone out of habit. Even though she already knew what she would see, one missed call from earlier, one voicemail she had not yet listened to, and the familiar knot tightened in her chest as she pressed play, her mother's voice soft but strained, talking about another appointment, another bill, another delay, and Lily closed her eyes briefly, leaning her head back against the cold metal frame, letting the words settle in silence. After the message ended, she exhaled slowly, then reached into her bag and pulled out the small folded slip of paper she always carried, smoothing it open with careful hands as if it were something fragile, something that could break if handled too roughly, and stared at the words she had written months ago during a rare quiet moment, a simple list of things she had once believed she could fix, things that now felt further away than ever. A soft movement nearby pulled her attention, and she glanced up to see the same young family from the diner standing a few feet away. The little boy now wrapped in his mother's coat, his small hands clutching a half-finished drawing, while his father spoke quietly into a phone, his voice tight with worry. Lily watched them for a moment, something in her chest shifting, then without fully thinking it through, she stepped forward, reaching into her apron pocket and pulling out most of the tips she had just counted, her fingers hesitating for only a second before she extended them toward the woman. "Hey," Lily said gently, offering a small, reassuring smile, "I think you might need this more than I do tonight," and the woman blinked in surprise, shaking her head at first. But Lily simply pressed the bills into her hand anyway, her voice soft but firm. "It is okay, really," she added, and after a brief pause, the woman's expression softened into something grateful, something almost disbelieving, and she whispered a quiet "thank you." Lily nodded, stepping back just as the bus pulled up with a low hiss, the doors folding open as warm air spilled out into the night, and she climbed aboard, dropping her last few coins into the fare box, finding a seat by the window where the glass was fogged from the difference in temperature, and as the city began to move past her in blurred streaks of light, she rested her head lightly against the window, her reflection faint and tired but steady. She did not notice the black sedan parked across the street from the bus stop, or the man sitting inside it, watching quietly as the bus disappeared into traffic, his expression unreadable but his eyes fixed on the memory of what he had just witnessed, as if the answer he had been looking for had finally revealed itself in a way he had not expected. The next morning arrived too quickly, the kind of grey Chicago morning where the sky never quite decided to wake up, and Lily Carter stood in front of the small bathroom mirror in her shared apartment, brushing her hair back into a loose tie while the faucet dripped steadily behind her, each drop echoing louder than it should have in the cramped space. She looked at her reflection for a moment longer than usual, taking in the faint circles under her eyes, the quiet exhaustion that had settled into her expression over time, and then she forced a small smile, the same one she used at the diner, the one that said everything was fine even when it was not. Her phone buzzed softly on the counter, pulling her attention, and she glanced down to see a message from her landlord, short and polite but impossible to ignore, reminding her that rent was now 5 days overdue, and Lily exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together as she set the phone face down without replying, because she did not have an answer yet, and thinking about it would not create one. She grabbed her bag, slipped on her worn sneakers, and stepped out into the cool morning air, the city already moving around her in quiet urgency, people heading to jobs, to meetings, to places that seemed more certain than hers, and for a moment she wondered what it felt like to wake up without calculating every dollar before even getting out of bed. By the time she reached the diner, the bell above the door chimed softly as she pushed it open, greeted by the familiar warmth and the scent of fresh coffee, and she tied her apron around her waist, slipping into routine as if it were the only stable thing she had left. The morning crowd trickled in steadily, construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts, office employees tapping on their phones while sipping coffee, and Lily moved between tables with practiced ease, her smile automatic, her voice light, but her mind still lingered somewhere between the unpaid bills and her mother's voicemail. She barely noticed when the man from the night before walked in again, taking the same seat in booth 7 as if it had been reserved for him, his presence quiet but deliberate. And it was not until she turned with a pot of coffee in hand that her eyes landed on him, and she paused for just a fraction of a second. Something about seeing him again felt unexpected, like a question that had not been fully answered, but she quickly recovered, stepping over with a polite nod as she poured coffee into his cup. "Back again?" she asked lightly, her tone casual but curious, and he met her gaze with that same steady look, the one that seemed to see more than it should. "I wanted to see if your answer would change in the morning," he replied, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, and Lily let out a small breath of amusement, shaking her head slightly as she leaned back just enough to Rest her hand against the edge of the table. Morning does not change much, she said honestly, glancing briefly toward the window where the city moved on without pause. It just makes everything feel a little more real, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet between them filled only by the low hum of the diner and the distant sound of traffic outside. The man studied her again, as if weighing something unseen, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded card. Placing it on the table but not sliding it toward her yet. "What if I told you that your wish could actually happen?" he said, his tone measured, not dramatic, just certain in a way that made Lily's brow furrow slightly. She looked at the card, then back at him, a flicker of skepticism crossing her face as she crossed her arms lightly, not defensive but cautious. "I would say that sounds like something people say when they want something in return," she replied, her voice steady but not unkind. And the corner of his mouth lifted faintly, almost like he had expected that answer. "And what if I do not want anything?" he asked quietly, and Lily held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something she could not quite name, before shaking her head with a soft, almost tired smile. "Then I would say you are asking the wrong person," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "because I do not know how to believe in things like that anymore." And as she turned to move back toward the counter, the man's eyes followed her, not with disappointment, but with a growing certainty that whatever he had come looking for, he was closer to finding it than he had been in a very long time. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of coffee refills and hurried orders, but something had shifted, subtle yet persistent, like a question Lily Carter could not quite shake, and every time she glanced toward booth 7, she found the man still there, not rushing, not distracted, simply observing the world around him with a patience that felt out of place in a diner where everything moved fast and nothing stayed long. By noon the crowd thickened, voices rising, plates clattering, and Lily slipped deeper into rhythm, balancing trays, calling out orders, thanking customers with the same practiced warmth, yet beneath it all her thoughts kept circling back to his words, to that card he had placed on the table but never offered, as if it carried a weight she had not yet earned the right to hold. When the lunch rush finally began to ease, she wiped her hands on her apron and made her way back over, partly out of habit, partly out of something she did not want to name, and stopped beside the booth with a small tilt of her head. "You have been here a while," she said, her tone light but edged with curiosity. "Most people do not stay this long unless they are avoiding something," and he looked up at her, a faint smile touching his expression, not defensive, just thoughtful. "Or looking for something," he replied, and Lily let out a soft breath, shaking her head as she leaned one hand against the table. "And did you find it?" she asked, not expecting a real answer, but he held her gaze for a moment before speaking. "I think I am getting closer," and there was something in the way he said it that made her straighten slightly, a flicker of unease mixing with curiosity. She glanced down at the untouched card still resting near his hand, its clean edges standing out against the worn surface of the table, and for a brief second she considered asking about it, but instead she reached for his empty cup, pouring fresh coffee with steady hands. "You know," she said quietly, almost to fill the silence, "people who promise things usually expect something back, even if they say they do not," and he nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth he had heard many times before. "That is usually how it works," he agreed, then paused, his voice lowering slightly. "But what if the return is not what you think?" And Lily frowned faintly, setting the pot down as she crossed her arms loosely, her posture guarded now. "Then I would still be careful," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "because nothing that sounds that easy ever is." And for a moment the noise of the diner seemed to fade around them, leaving only that quiet exchange hanging between two people who saw the world from very different sides. The man studied her again, not with judgment, but with a growing respect, then finally slid the card across the table toward her, stopping just short of her hand. "Keep it," he said simply, "in case you ever change your mind." And Lily hesitated, her eyes lingering on the card as if it might burn if she touched it, then slowly reached down and picked it up, turning it over between her fingers, the surface smooth, heavier than it looked. But she did not read it, not yet, instead slipping it into the pocket of her apron without comment, as if acknowledging its existence without accepting what it might represent. "I should get back to work," she said after a moment, her voice returning to its usual tone, and he nodded, leaning back slightly as if satisfied with that small step. "Of course," he replied, watching as she turned away and moved back into the flow of the diner, her figure blending once again into the rhythm of ordinary life, but now with something new tucked quietly at her side, something that neither of them mentioned, yet both understood had already begun to change the course of what would come next. That night, long after the last customer had left and the diner lights dimmed to their softer, quieter glow, Lily Carter found herself alone at the counter, wiping down the same clean surface twice without realizing it, her mind somewhere else entirely, circling back again and again to the weight of the card tucked in her apron pocket. She had not looked at it all day, not once, as if avoiding it might somehow keep everything simple, keep her life contained within the familiar boundaries she understood. But now, in the stillness of closing time, that small rectangle of possibility felt louder than the silence around her. She let out a slow breath, setting the cloth aside as her fingers hesitated at her pocket, brushing against the edge of the card before finally pulling it out, turning it over carefully as if it might reveal something different than what she expected. The surface was smooth, crisp, untouched by the wear and tear that marked everything else in her world, and for a moment she simply stared at it, her reflection faintly visible against its clean finish, before her eyes dropped to the name printed across it, and everything inside her seemed to still. Ethan Cole, Chief Executive Officer, Cole Industries. The words did not make sense at first, not fully, as if her mind refused to connect them to the man who had sat quietly in booth 7, drinking coffee like any other customer, asking questions that felt too personal to belong to someone with a title like that. Lily blinked once, then again, her grip tightening slightly on the card as a dozen thoughts rushed through her at once: disbelief, confusion, a flicker of something close to frustration, because suddenly nothing about the past 24 hours felt as simple as it had seemed. She let out a quiet, almost breathless laugh, shaking her head as she leaned back against the counter, staring at the card as if it might explain itself, but it did not. It only sat there, solid and undeniable, a piece of truth she had not been prepared to hold. Of course, she murmured under her breath, the words carrying a mix of irony and resignation, because it made sense in a way that she did not like. People like him did not sit in diners asking strangers about their wishes unless there was a reason, unless it was part of something larger, something she had not agreed to be part of. Her fingers curled slightly around the edges of the card, and for a brief moment she considered throwing it away, dropping it into the trash and pretending none of it had happened, because that would be easier, safer, a return to the life she knew how to survive. But instead, she folded it carefully and slipped it into her bag, not as acceptance, not yet, but as acknowledgement, because ignoring it would not make it disappear. Outside, the night air had cooled, carrying a faint hint of something new as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the city quieter now, less demanding, and for once she did not rush toward the bus stop right away, instead pausing under the dim streetlight as she pulled out her phone and stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the contact icon before she stopped herself, exhaling slowly as she lowered the device. This was not her world, she reminded herself, not his world, not the kind where people like Ethan Cole changed lives with a single decision, because she had learned the hard way that nothing came without a cost, and she had already paid enough. Yet as she finally started walking, the card still resting in her bag, she could not ignore the quiet shift inside her, the small crack in the certainty she had built around herself, because for the first time in a long while, the idea that something might actually change did not feel entirely impossible, and that alone was enough to make her steps feel just a little less heavy as she disappeared into the night. The next few days passed with a strange kind of tension that Lily Carter could not quite name, as if something invisible had shifted just beneath the surface of her life, subtle but persistent, and no matter how much she tried to return to her routine, to the rhythm of pouring coffee and taking orders and counting every dollar twice, that small folded card in her bag refused to be forgotten. She did not call the number, not once, even when her phone sat silent on the counter and the weight of unpaid bills pressed heavier with each passing hour, even when her mother's condition hung in the background of every thought like a quiet clock ticking down. Instead, she chose the only thing she knew how to do. She kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led back to a question she was not ready to answer. On the fourth day, the diner felt unusually busy for a late afternoon, the kind of steady rush that left no room for distraction. And Lily moved quickly between tables, balancing trays, apologizing for delays, offering small smiles that hid the exhaustion settling deeper into her bones. It was in the middle of this rush that the manager, Tom, called her name from behind the counter, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise, and she turned, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached, her expression already bracing for something she could not control. Tom held a piece of paper in his hand, his brow furrowed in a way that made her chest tighten slightly, and without preamble he handed it to her. "You need to take a look at this," he said, his tone less annoyed than usual, almost uncertain, and Lily glanced down, her eye scanning the printed lines quickly before slowing, her breath catching just slightly as she realized what she was looking at. It was a notice, not of eviction this time, but of payment, her overdue rent marked as cleared, the balance stamped in bold letters that did not seem real, and for a moment she simply stared at it, her mind struggling to connect the information with her reality. I did not pay this, she said quietly, more to herself than to Tom, and he shrugged, leaning back against the counter. Well, someone did, he replied, watching her carefully. Came through this morning, full amount, no issues, and Lily felt something shift inside her again, sharper this time, more immediate, because there was only one explanation she did not want to accept. She folded the paper slowly, her fingers steady even as her thoughts raced, and nodded once, forcing her voice to remain calm. Thank you, she said, though the words felt misplaced, directed at no one in particular, and turned back toward the floor. But her movements were no longer automatic, no longer grounded in the same certainty as before. Throughout the rest of her shift, small things began to surface, pieces that did not fit until they suddenly did. A message from the hospital confirming her mother's upcoming appointment had been scheduled sooner than expected. A call she missed from an unfamiliar number. A subtle change in the way the world seemed to respond around her, as if something had already begun moving without her permission. By the time her shift ended, the sky outside had turned a soft shade of evening blue, and Lily stood just inside the diner door, her bag slung over her shoulder, her hand resting lightly against it where the card still waited, no longer just a possibility, but a presence she could not ignore. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking in a slow breath, then reached inside, pulling the card out once more and holding it between her fingers, the name staring back at her with the same quiet certainty as before. This time, she did not hesitate as long, her thumb moving across her phone screen until the number was entered, her heart steady but firm in a way it had not been days ago, because whatever this was, whatever he had started, she was not going to let it unfold without understanding it. As the call began to ring, Lily lifted her gaze toward the street beyond the glass, the city stretching out in front of her, familiar yet suddenly different, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was simply trying to survive it. She felt like she was about to step into something she could not yet see, but could no longer avoid. The call did not ring for long, only once, maybe twice, before the line clicked and a calm, familiar voice answered on the other end, steady and composed as if he had been expecting it. Lily, Ethan Cole said quietly, and the way he said her name, without hesitation, without surprise, made something tighten in her chest. She did not respond immediately, her fingers gripping the phone just a little tighter as she stepped further away from the diner door, the cool evening air brushing against her face, grounding her in the moment. You paid my rent, she said finally, her voice direct, not accusatory but not grateful either, simply stating the truth as she understood it. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not long enough to be evasive, just enough to acknowledge the weight of what she had said. Yes, he replied, just as simply, and Lily closed her eyes for a second, exhaling slowly. And my mom's appointment, she added, her tone quieter now, more controlled. And again, he did not deny it. Yes, he repeated, his voice still calm, still measured, as if this were a conversation about something ordinary, something expected. Lily opened her eyes, her gaze drifting across the street where cars passed in a steady rhythm, headlights cutting through the early evening, and for a moment she said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them, because there were too many things she could say and none of them felt right. Why? She asked finally, the single word carrying more than it should have, and this time, when Ethan answered, there was a slight shift in his tone, not defensive, but more deliberate. Because you asked for nothing, he said, and Lily let out a soft, almost disbelieving breath, shaking her head even though he could not see it. That was not a wish, she replied, her voice tightening slightly. That was me saying I did not want anything. And there it was, the edge she had been holding back, not anger exactly, but something close to it, something born from being pulled into something she had not agreed to. On the other end, Ethan was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. You chose someone else when you had every reason to choose yourself, he said, and Lily felt that shift again, that uncomfortable recognition of being seen in a way she had not intended. That is not nothing, he continued, his voice steady, that is everything. And for a second, she did not know how to respond, because part of her understood what he meant, but another part resisted it completely. You do not get to decide what my choices mean, she said firmly, her tone controlled but unwavering, and you definitely do not get to turn them into some kind of test. The last word came out sharper than she expected, and there was a brief silence after it, not tense, but significant, like a line had been drawn between them. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was softer, not apologetic, but honest in a way that caught her off guard. "You are right," he said, and Lily blinked slightly, not expecting that answer. "I cannot decide what your choices mean," he continued, "but I can decide what I do with what I see," and she swallowed, her grip on the phone loosening just a fraction as his words settled in. "Then you should have asked," she replied after a moment, her voice quieter now, less defensive, more grounded. "You should have given me a choice," and this time, the pause on the other end felt different, heavier, as if he was considering something he had not before. "That is fair," he said finally, and for the first time, there was something in his tone that was not entirely certain, not entirely controlled. "So let me ask now," he added, and Lily felt her breath catch slightly as she straightened, her attention fully drawn into the moment. "Would you be willing to meet me?" he said, not as a test, not as a favor, just as a conversation, and Lily stood there in the fading light, the city moving around her as always, but suddenly feeling distant, her mind quiet in a way it had not been all day, because this time, the choice was hers, and whatever came next would not be something decided for her, but something she stepped into on her own terms. The next evening arrived with a quiet kind of anticipation that Lily Carter tried not to acknowledge, but could not fully ignore, and as she stood in front of her small bedroom mirror, adjusting the sleeve of her only decent sweater, she caught herself pausing longer than necessary, her reflection staring back with a mix of uncertainty and resolve that felt unfamiliar. She had said yes, not quickly, not easily, but deliberately, and now the weight of that choice settled in as she stepped out into the cool Chicago evening, the city lights beginning to glow softly against the darkening sky. The location he had suggested was not extravagant, not the kind of place she would expect from someone like Ethan Cole, but a quiet cafe tucked along a quieter street, the kind of place where conversations could exist without interruption. And as she approached, her steps slowed just slightly, her eyes scanning the windows before she reached for the door. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, understated, the low hum of conversation blending with soft music, and it took only a moment before she spotted him seated near the back, dressed simply again, no suit, no visible signs of the world his name represented, and yet now that she knew, it was impossible not to see it, the quiet confidence, the stillness that did not come from uncertainty but from control. He stood as she approached, a small, respectful gesture that caught her off guard, and for a brief second neither of them spoke. The space between them filled with everything that had happened and everything that had not yet been said. "You came," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying a note of something softer, something less certain than before, and Lily nodded once, taking the seat across from him, her hands resting lightly in her lap as she met his gaze directly. "I said I would," she replied, her tone steady, not cold, not warm, simply honest. A server approached briefly, taking their order, and when the moment passed, the quiet returned, more intentional this time, as if both of them understood that this was not a casual conversation, but something that required more than surface-level words. Lily leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence first. "If this is where you explain everything," she said, her voice calm but firm, "then you should start now," and Ethan nodded, as if he had expected nothing less, his hands resting loosely on the table as he considered where to begin. "I did not come to that diner by accident," he said, his words measured, direct, and Lily felt a small shift inside her, not surprise, but confirmation, and he continued, "I have spent the last year trying to understand something I lost along the way," his gaze steady, not avoiding hers, "something about people, about what matters when everything else is stripped away," and she listened, her expression unreadable but attentive. "So you ask strangers about their wishes," she said, a faint edge in her voice, not mocking, but not entirely convinced, and Ethan allowed a small, almost self-aware smile. "Not exactly," he replied, "I create moments where the answer cannot be rehearsed," and Lily leaned back slightly, crossing her arms loosely as she absorbed that, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "And what was I supposed to be?" she asked, another data point. The question was quiet, but it carried weight, and for the first time, Ethan's expression shifted in a way that felt less controlled, more human. "No," he said, more firmly than before, "you were not supposed to be anything." He paused, then added, "That is why it mattered," and Lily held his gaze, searching for something beyond the words, something real, and for a moment the room seemed to fade around them, leaving only that exchange, that Fragile space where two very different worlds had collided and neither of them could step back to where they had been before. She exhaled slowly, her posture softening just slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. "You changed things without asking me," she said quietly, and Ethan nodded, accepting it without defense. "I did," he replied, "and I cannot undo that." And there it was, the honesty she had demanded, not perfect, not clean, but real enough to hold. And as the server returned with their drinks, setting them down gently between them, Lily reached for her cup, her fingers wrapping around its warmth as she looked at him again. This time not as a stranger, not as a name on a card, but as someone who had stepped into her life without permission and was now asking, for the first time, to be there by choice. The conversation lingered long after the coffee had gone cold, stretching into something neither Lily Carter nor Ethan Cole had planned, but both seemed unwilling to end. And as the cafe around them slowly emptied, the quiet between their words became less guarded, less sharp, replaced by something steadier, something that felt almost like understanding. Lily sat back in her chair, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup absent-mindedly as she watched him. Really watched him this time, not as the man who had interfered in her life, not as the name printed on a card, but as someone who had chosen to sit across from her and stay, even when she had every reason to walk away. "You still did not answer my question," she said finally, her voice softer now, but no less certain, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "Which one?" he asked, and she held his gaze, steady and direct. "What happens now?" she replied. And for a moment, he did not answer right away, as if weighing something more than just the words. "That depends," he said slowly, "on whether you believe that one moment can actually change the direction of everything that comes after." And Lily let out a small breath, shaking her head faintly. "I think moments only matter if people choose to do something with them," she said, her tone thoughtful, not defensive, and something in his expression shifted at that, a quiet recognition. As if she had just answered a question he had not yet asked, he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, more intentional. "Then choose," he said. Not as a challenge, not as a test, but as an invitation, and Lily felt the weight of that word settle differently than it had before, because this time it was not about proving anything, not about passing or failing, it was simply about deciding what she wanted. She looked down for a brief second, her thoughts moving through everything that had led her here, the long shifts, the unpaid bills, the quiet sacrifices no one ever saw, and then back up at him, her expression clearer now, more certain. "You asked me what I would wish for," she said, her voice calm but steady, "and I did not answer you the way you expected." And Ethan nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. "You answered exactly the way I needed," he replied, and Lily smiled faintly, not because she fully agreed, but because she understood what he meant now, at least a little more than she had before. She reached into her bag, pulling out the small folded slip of paper she had carried for so long, the one filled with things she had once believed she needed to fix her life, and for a moment she held it between her fingers before setting it gently on the table between them. "I used to think this was what mattered," she said quietly, "a list of everything I needed to survive." And Ethan glanced at it briefly before looking back at her, waiting, and she continued, "But I think I was wrong," she added, her voice soft but certain, and then she looked at him, really looked at him. Not as a solution, not as an escape, but as a possibility she was choosing on her own terms. "This time," she said, her lips curving into the smallest, most genuine smile he had seen from her yet, "I am choosing for myself," and the word settled between them, simple but profound, carrying a meaning that neither of them needed to define out loud. Ethan exhaled slowly, a quiet release of something he had been holding onto for longer than he realized, and nodded once, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had finally understood what the question had been all along. Outside, the city lights continued to glow, steady and unchanging, but inside that small cafe, something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, the kind of change that did not announce itself, but stayed, shaping everything that came after in ways neither of them could fully see yet, but both were finally ready to step into together.